Okay, well, we can get started then. So hello, thank you all for being here. My name is Emily, she, her pronouns, and I'm the USG Senator for Diversity. So I wanted to do this panel and I partnered with the Leadership Center because I think this is a topic that isn't really explored a whole lot in higher education. And I thought it'd be interesting to bring a few people who have leadership experience and just living on campus and being a part of the community experience and hear their perspectives and opinions on different topics relating to leadership. So I have a little PowerPoint I put together. So we're just going to go over some preliminary things just to kind of clarify what we'll be talking about and just to kind of distinguish what different terms mean. So there's two different terms you'll hear most often from people talking about Latinx or Hispanic topics. So Latinx refers to people from Latin American countries. So this includes South America, Central America, the Caribbeans. So anywhere in just the southern region of the United States is Latinx. And then Hispanic are people from Spanish-speaking countries. So Spain is included in that, but Brazil isn't included in that because Brazil doesn't speak Spanish, they speak Portuguese. So just a little distinguishing there. And you'll hear people refer to themselves with both identities, kind of just their personal preference, what they identify as, going back and forth. So there's that. And then why is there an X in Latinx? So it's more common in the past few years that people have said Latinx versus just Latino or Latina. And that primarily has to do with being more gender inclusive. So Spanish is a very gendered language. And this is kind of an initiative to have it more gender neutral. But it is a very also Americanized version or like an English-fied version because this isn't really something you can pronounce super easily in Spanish. And so in Spanish and in Spanish communities, often it's pronounced with an E at the end, so it's Latine, to be more gender neutral. So people will also say that in terms of in place of Latinx. So all of that just is essentially the same thing. So with that being discussed, I'm going to bring up our panelists for tonight. I hope you all approve of these pictures that I found of you. No one sent me their photos. So first we have Alice. Feel free to come up. Alice, yay. Alice is a senior psychology major. She's the USG Director of Programming, and she's a Sister Circle Vice President, and she was also a KT mentor. We have Alice. And next we have Eric Gomez, who is a junior political science major, USG Director of Governmental Affairs, and the SALSA Social Media Chair. So thank you, Eric. And we have Ari Bliss, who is a senior audio painting major, I believe. And she's the SALSA Vice President and also the Co-Director of Marketing for Sister Circle. So thank you also for being here. And then we have our final member of the panelists, Daniel Diaz-Nielsen, who is a doctoral student and also on the Interprofessional Leadership Cultural Foundations Board, the Director for the Office of Diversity Outreach and Development, EHHS, and also KT Advocate. So thank you all for being here. I have some questions that I prepared ahead of time. They've all seen these questions, and some of these questions are directed more specifically at each person, but also there's a few questions that they all have the chance to answer as they're more broad questions. So cool, so we'll start it off. Alice, are you ready to go first?
Yes.
This is going to be aimed at Alice, but everyone is open to answer this one. And that just is, what does your identity mean to you?
Okay, so identity to me, well, my identity is how I think about myself and also the characteristics that define me. So like, I wear my ethnicity like on my sleeve. I'm like, I am so proud to be the daughter of a Mexican immigrant, and also my dad's from Puerto Rico too. So I'm always like so excited to like announce that. And I feel like with identity, it's just all the different hats you wear. So not only am I Latina, I'm also a student leader. I'm really involved on campus, and I feel like being a Latina in a PWI, it's super important to have that representation there. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else like to talk about what their identity means to them?
I'll go. So I think identity is about just being yourself, no matter what, just being like unapologetically yourself, and also celebrating yourself. Because growing up, sometimes you feel like you wish you looked a different way because the media portrays a certain way of looking, like you're supposed to be fair skinned, and like that's like what we see all over the magazines. And when we're looking at TV, like when you're looking at like Latinx figures, they're just, kind of like stereotypical usually, and I just think it's super important to just celebrate yourself and accept yourself, even if you might not look like what people think you should look like.
For sure. I sat in on the diversity training in the Leadership Center today, and we talked about how biases and stereotypes can inflict our own self-perceptions and how that can be really harmful. Oh, thank you.
For me, identity comes from my name. I had the beautiful chance of having Professor Okanta from the Oscar Ritchie Hall to be my professor for Black Experience 1 and 2. And a lot of our, what he was trying to install in us is that our name is our main form of identity. It's how we respond and what we respond to. So I take a lot of joy in my name being like Ariana, and how people address me, it's either Ari, Ariana, Adi, or Ariana. And it just separates those people into categories of my life. So people from high school call me Ariana, people here call me Ari, but the Latinx community calls me Adi here. So, it's just there's little layers to it. And yeah, my identity really comes from my name and how I treasure it.
As someone who also went to high school with you, I noticed you started going by different things as well. So
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
cool.
I like how Adi said that puts me in a category, right? Depends on who I am. As a Latino, as a Puerto Rican, and actually, I often literally wear it on my face when I wear it. I brought this because I wanted to make sure. Some people, I just want to make sure they realize exactly right away. But when I think about the name thing, is I think I often tell folks your name is the most personal thing you have with you. And oftentimes, it does carry a history and a story too, right? We're all named what we are, often for a reason, right? I think about my name and who I'm named after and all the things that it means to when I tell my story. But I also think of I'm probably the only one. My daughter is named Daniela, right? And so she's named after me. And so what story and what kind of legacy do I have with that? But so when it comes to identity, one of the interesting things for me is especially my Latino identity has actually become more or stronger in the last 10 years because I just met my birth father, who's Puerto Rican, for the first time then. And so I always knew I was different and people looked at I wasn't fair skinned where I was why are you always tan? Well, I'm Puerto Rican, and because I grew up in a part of PWI, I went to school to PWI. I still do now, right? And so that's where I think identity is. It's evolved, right? So mine's actually become stronger as far as being Latino in the last few years, more so than it was maybe when I was younger. So that's just how my story is.
Yeah, that's definitely really powerful. Also, with the developments politically in the past few years of how important it is to even protect your identity and embrace it. Yeah, thank you all for your answers. So now this one's going to be specific to Eric. How does your identity relate to the positions that you've been in?
So it's kind of challenging sometimes being in a predominantly white space because it's just intimidating at first. And it's kind of hard because you don't know if you have that sense of belonging because not everyone looks like you. And I'm also going to say it's pretty challenging being in a predominantly Hispanic space as well. And that's because of just my intersectionality. So I'm a part of the LGBTQ community. So I grew up around mainly Hispanic people. That was my community. And, being around family, strangers, and friends, sometimes I would hear, backhand comments or sometimes to my face. So then that's kind of what I connotated all people of color to be like. So then when I first came to campus, I was thinking, oh, should I try to join salsa? What if they're just like everyone else back home? And that was really challenging because no matter where I went, it was hard to feel that sense of belonging. And we always talk about, inclusion, and that's a new buzzword. You hear it all the time, inclusion. Inclusion is allowing someone to be in a space. Belonging is when that person feels and knows that they're welcome in that space. And I think it's just super important that everyone has a sense of belonging.
That's a really great point. Thank you for talking about that for sure. We'll go on next to Ari. Have you faced adversity in applying to or being in leadership roles because of your identity?
I definitely have. I feel it was more of a backhand thing than someone intentionally trying to hurt my feelings. With one of my positions that isn't really included with like my job descriptions or that's like listed up here. It's just like a leadership in my major that I try to like establish. We are really on our solo projects with like a lot of stuff. So it's just hearing students over time say things about how do I lead in being like a painter and like a revolutionist like with my painting. Having to defend that part of my identity when all my portraits are pretty much describing my experience as being Black and Puerto Rican, having to like be in a space where I have to just tell people why I'm there. It gets really exhausting. And it happened a lot when I first came here as a freshman. And I think it's people have found subtler, like made it more subtle as to asking why I'm there or like why do I take up the space that I do. And yeah, that's like the main thing I could really think about because it affects me like it's going to affect me here, but then it also is going to affect me out when I'm living somewhere else. And I remember I had told somebody in one of my classes in passing, like, oh, I'm going to be in San Francisco in the next 5 years. Like I was definitely going to be there. And they just kind of snickered at me. And it was in a way where it was kind of like menacing, like, how do you, they just don't understand why I take up the space I do. So yeah, and it's kind of like backhanded more than it is like in my face, but being like a person of color, like I've always experienced this and it's easy for me to pick up on it. So yeah.
And do you think that that kind of backlash has given you your own self-confidence in
Oh yeah,
being in different spaces?
I think so. Like it used to really tear me down because I would be like, oh, I don't belong, I guess. Like my art isn't that good. But I made, Unidad, the like,
Yes, go
art
look at it if you have
exhibition.
it.
This art exhibition at the Center for the Visual Arts, which is my major's building, and is a space that I curated, created, everything with the help of faculty and staff. But that was like my big, just I belong here. Like this is my mark. Like I feel like I shouldn't have to do that, but I did it, and I think it made the impact it needed to because the way that people now talk or structure their sentences with me is totally different than before. I'm not just like a student that they could bypass. I'm now someone that is like making the stepping stones to my career. And it's because of that initial backlash that I feel like I gained the confidence to really be up there. I wish I didn't have to. And I wish that other students also didn't feel like they had to, or they have to do what I did to get a voice. But it's just the times we're in, and it's a subtle little culture that some people don't really see. You have to be in it to see it, really.
For sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that too. And yes, if you haven't gone to her exhibit yet, please do. Super
Yes,
cool.
please. It's really nice. Really cool art. My art's in it too.
All right, and our next question for Daniel. So what efforts do you specifically make to create those spaces where students of different communities can feel welcomed and supported?
I suppose that's a hard question to maybe to answer, although I'll do my best because I feel like maybe it's better if others maybe answer that.
Okay.
But what I try to do, and I like what Eric said about the difference between inclusion and belonging, right? I think there's at least the way I look at things is if I can create spaces both physically and also the way I communicate or how I say things or do things, and also do it consistently. Because I think sometimes folks will think, especially people in my position, both we all know I'm a doctoral student, but I work here on campus. And so I'm sure there are students, many that think, oh, they're just doing it because it's this time of the day or it's this event. And so for me, I try to be as congruent in what I say and what I do. So I think that's part of it. I think showing up to multiple events and things that are important to students and to others, especially when they have different identities than I do. I have definitely some identities that I carry or I identify with that are marginalized, but I also have many that are very privileged, right? And I know that. But giving the opportunity to uplift others and kind of what I always say, reach back and pull up, is how I try to create that space or spaces to do that, right? So going to Unidad or going to Pride, right? Or doing, going to bus meetings if they ask me, or just going to Unamart, right? Like, or AAPI, right? Like all those things I also do in my private life, right? You'll see me in other communities do those things as well. And so I think that's how I create spaces, by being congruent. Again, I'm literal in trying to create spaces to do it as well. But it's, again, I hope, and I believe, but I do hope that students feel that. And I think I do that enough where I do feel that response, right? I don't get invited to things like this if people don't think that there's a congruence there, right? And I hope that I can continue to live that out as best as possible.
Sure, and I think you're pretty successful in it because several people have recommended that I invite you to these panels. So you're definitely showing up in the right spaces.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really great point about how representation, just showing up, is really important to people. Thank you. So Alice, next question, kind of getting into it a little more. What challenges have you experienced through being part of the Latinx community? Whether that's through student leadership, being a student, or just in life in general?
I feel like I really didn't face troubles outside of like having an immigrant parent and recognizing all of those problems, like with immigration and all that stuff. I really didn't experience personal issues until I came into a PWI, and especially like utilizing some multicultural spaces. My biggest problem was that like I had to take on this ally role rather than taking up that space myself, even though I very much belong to be there, just because I've noticed that I have to over-explain the oppression I face. I'm a victim of overt systemic and institutional racism, yet people don't see that because of the color of my skin, which never made sense to me because I'm like, okay, I feel like I look like a stereotypical Latina, but to other people we're like, oh no, like I get constantly mislabeled here. So it's just hard navigating certain spaces, and it's just easier to be like, okay, let me put my identity in the back burner, and how can I serve you as a student leader? Let me just be that ally. So it's like constantly not knowing, do I tell you about the stuff I face? Do I not? So
I think invalidation is a really difficult part of that, and then also at the same time holding that like allyship or privilege in certain areas, but at the same time it's like, well, I also sometimes might experience certain issues that might be invalidated or just not talked about sometimes. So.
No, yeah, definitely. I feel like another big part is also knowing that you don't represent everybody, because like Eric was saying with intersectionality, there's that, and also there are like Latinos come in many different colors, shapes, sizes, like all of that. Especially when talking with Afro Latinos, they have a different experience than like I would. I'm not Afro Latino, so just making sure that I'm incredibly inclusive and they're inclusive as well. I'm like, fine.
Great. And do you think that any of those challenges kind of also impacted your personal self-identity, or just helped you fully realize it more?
It made me like just be more motivated to take up those spaces. I'm like, I really shouldn't be feeling that way. And that's one of the reasons why I became a KT mentor. So I came in as a mentee. So I'm like, okay, let me close off my college career being a mentor, and also being a part of Sister Circle, which is a predominantly Black organization. It is for women of color. So I'm like, if not me, then who? I just kept reminding myself that, because it's really important to take up that space. And if you don't have that representation, how are you going to ensure that you're being advocated for?
Thank you. That was a really good point at the end as well. So, Eric, so do you think that your journey in applying to college or applying to leadership positions was also impacted by your identity in any way?
I feel like my identity definitely impacted me applying to college. So my parents are immigrants. They came here from Colombia, and they pretty much like just left their family behind and just came to the United States and sacrificed everything for their family. So it was kind of like, oh, no pressure, but like, you got to go to college and you got to do this and that. And it was hard because my parents never went to a typical four-year school in the United States. So they didn't understand the process, and they always tried to help me, but they didn't know how to like work the system. And I just remember I would spend a bunch of late nights with like me and my friend, like at a cafe or something, just trying to figure out how these things even work. And it was just really difficult because of my first generation college student status, you know, not having like that help from my parents that other students had the privilege of. And then also my socioeconomic status, I felt like I didn't have the same resources other people had. You know, when I wouldn't understand something in a class, it would be like, oh, tough luck, you know, get tutoring. And then I couldn't get tutoring because I couldn't afford it. So I worked as hard as I could to get my grades up. But when I took the SAT and ACT, I didn't get the best scores. And I just like kept, you know, kind of like punching myself in a sense, like, why did I mess up? Why, like, what could I have done better? And I started to worry, like, would I even get into college in the first place? And I feel like, you know, I just had some barriers that other students didn't.
So you say that the pressure to succeed also just made it a lot more difficult.
Sorry.
The pressure to succeed also just made it a lot more difficult in your journey.
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. So would you say that there's like the pressure from wanting to be successful and wanting to be like impress your parents just made it difficult?
I think what was hard is that like, it's just, my parents have had every intent to come here so that I would be successful. So it was just a ton of pressure, and it was hard because I knew they were doing everything they could. But at the same time, they didn't know like the process. And I just think what helped me out was, you know, having friends and a support system. And, you know, like I went to school in downtown, so that was like an hour commute. And the reason why I went to school all the way in downtown is because my home school wasn't the greatest school. So I went over there, and because I had good counselors, I had a good therapist, I had good friends. And that's why ultimately I was able to succeed despite those barriers.
Thank you for sharing that as well. So we're going to skip over to Daniel real quick, and then we're going to go back to a question for everyone. So you'll get to start with it. Okay. So as you kind of touched upon a little bit with just going to different organizations, different meetings, and kind of making yourself known, do you think that your presence just as a person of color helped those students feel more welcomed, or that they could come to talk to you about things?
I'd like to think it does, and then specifically for Latinx individuals, right? Because I was actually thinking this morning, thinking about tonight, and then there are some faculty members who are Latinx, but I think I might be one of the few professionals or like administrators on campus that are Latino. I see nods. Like, I don't know if there's anybody that is, right? And so I don't see that necessarily anymore. Like Eric talked about, maybe that pressure being like maybe the only, but I do now, I'm more confident, or at least recognize the power of my presence in the sense of like, there are no other Latinos around. And so, and even as I'm getting my doctorate, like there are even less Latinos getting doctorates, right? And so to me, I hope that it is the opportunity to see, and I think there is one of the things when I'm not wearing a mask, I think I always kind of joke, is like, I have a face that's culturally ambiguous, right? Like when I was in high school, I got called not great names we won't share, which I'm sure you all probably can fill in the blanks. In college, I was in a program for people of color, and I remember one of the actually, she's a friend to now, she always denies it, but she was like, why are you in this program? You just look like a tan white boy, right? And so those are things that I internalized. I'm like, and part of why I maybe didn't want my identity, didn't want to embrace it in spaces, and I wanted to be a student leader because I did a ton of things in my university experiences, like many of these and people here. And so for me, now that have advanced degrees, like my birth parents don't have high school diplomas, they don't have GEDs. right? I was in foster care for most of my life, and I was adopted at age 15. So like, I have a unique experience in just those things as well. The other intersection things you can't see until I just tell you, right? And so being a person of color, I'll also say sometimes people, even administrators, don't always see me as a person of color. I say my middle name because all the time, because I want people to know. I wear this mask, especially now because, well, you should wear a mask, but also I want people to be reminded that there are Latinos around. And it's a way for me to also educate folks to be like, you know, we are successful, we do belong. And in a way, it sounds strange in the time that I know maybe it's weird that we always say this, right? As people of color, well, we have to keep trailblazing. It's like, why do we have to keep trailblazing? It seems odd that I am in 2021, almost like trailblazing for Latinos to be at a university campus in PWI, right? Like Kent State, like that seems odd to me, right? And so, yeah, I'm conscious of my presence. I hope again it does allow some folks, especially when I do KT or other things like that. That's why I'm a mentor. Like I want to make sure I'm again present enough, not only just in the times when it seems like the spotlight's there, but other times to make sure that, oh wait, no, like again, like I said earlier, the congruency of that. But it is something I do think about, and again, I hope it does make an impact beyond just, oh, there's Daniel. So.
Thank you for sharing. That really reminds me of a conversation that I had with Alice in a class one time that talked about how names are also such an important part of being either validated or invalidated for identity, and how you would never guess by my name that I am Latina, but if I had my mother's maiden name, for example, Yanez, like that would be a completely different story for a lot of people in terms of questioning my identity. So, and then goes back to what Ari said about how, you know, names have power and you have to kind of embrace that, but sometimes it's difficult if your name doesn't always match your cultural or like your background.
Yeah, if you Google Daniel Nilsson, you'll see blonde hair, blue-eyed man. Not me, right? No, not at all. And then I mentioned earlier, I met my birth father 10 years ago. His last name is Velasquez, and his first name is Angel. If I was a Velasquez, that would be easier to walk around. People like, oh yeah, okay, I see you, you're tan. Oh, okay, you must be Latino, right? Like again, I ask people all the time in the sessions I do for trainings, what do you think I am, race and ethnicity? And I get so many things, Italian and Middle Eastern. I've got, you know, Turkish, Spanish, maybe you're Hispanic, you know, all these different things, because but that's, I think, a very important piece too, to think about that.
For sure, awesome. So we're going to go into our final question that everyone's going to have the opportunity to answer, but we'll start with Ari because I didn't pass you on. So this is kind of a heavier question, but I think it's an important one to talk about. So when you reflect on recent events related to race in America, could you share an experience from your life that helped others better understand how this has been impacting you? And this can go back to even the 2016 election. So hard topic, but
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes.
Just one more time.
When you reflect on recent events related to race in America, could you share an experience from your life that would help others better understand how this is impacting you?
Oh, I just talked about this, yeah, with Mariah, who's our advisor for Sister Circle. Oh gosh, there's so many thoughts because I have like this whole thesis about it. Okay, so a few years back, I lost my cousin to gun violence, and he was shot. It was a drive-by shooting, and his name is Gooby. I'm just gonna keep saying Gooby. You guys are gonna be like, who the heck is Gooby? That's my cousin. That's who I lost, and it's like the gun violence that is happening in Cleveland has been something that has always been in the back of my head, and I never knew it was going to affect me like personally, because I come from like not where my cousin grew up, and you know, I just was so naive about it. But when he passed away, it was like all these bricks fell, and like it was just really heavy on like my whole family, and it was like a current event. It was an event that happened that affected, and that was when like all the walkouts were happening, especially at our high school. We had a lot of walkouts because of like gun violence and all that, like when that was really happening, like 2017, 2018. So I don't know, like that had like a big effect on my friends. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
And just how this has been impacting you.
Oh, yeah, it's always been like, in my major, I create art that is a part of the Black experience and a part of my identity. So right now I'm working on a piece that is of myself, but it has the same Coco bird, which is like a symbol for Black people looking back on our past and to move forward. But then I also have the Puerto Rican sun, because it's like all of the imagery of Puerto Rico is like the sun. And it's a mix of my two identities. So as I reflect on like my cousin, reflect on gun violence that's happening, I think about what it's a lot of stuff. I'm so sorry, but it's like the concept that we learned in Professor Ocanta's class, which is the concept of the new Negro, and how are we as a Black community when, because in that case it was about when we were coming out of slavery, but then there's still Jim Crow. Like, how do we advance as a people now that we go to college? And now my stuff is about the advancement of like the newest Black person, which is we are now generations deep, some of us in like college educated people, and how do we reflect on our experiences and how we push forward. So I don't know if I explained, but like my work is a reflection on the gun violence that happened to my cousin, because I realized that my family's not part of a statistic of how many families are affected by gun violence. And those are crazy, because like I never thought I was so naive. And now as I continue forward, and it was because, he was a Black man, how do I use that to push forward? And yeah, he's also Black and Puerto Rican, he's on my mom's side. So yeah, I use those experiences in my art, and I use my art to express who I am as my identity, and I show it to the world so that people can understand and see a different perspective on life, something I never thought I'd have to go through, but something that affects our future largely. Okay. Like I went on a tangent.
And you just sort of talked about how where we're from can have such a big role in how we react to the world as well. Because we're both from Shaker Heights, not the place that's kind of described as being this liberal bubble. That's kind of like just little, once you leave it, you're kind of shocked by how the real world is. But I think that's not really a great thing to say about a place, because it erases when stuff does happen that isn't okay. It will impact people very negatively.
Sure. Okay. So when it comes to race, I can't really, I don't know my race. That's the thing. My mom, she has very strong indigenous ancestry, so like Aztec, all that stuff, and it's very rich in our culture. You can see that. But like my last name's French. I didn't know that, but like it is. And with my dad being from Puerto Rico, there was a lot of colonization. So it's like, okay, what do I put on paper? Therefore, how do these certain problems in America, like, how does that affect me? Because if I were to put that I'm white, is it affecting me? And like I can relate to Ari with the whole gun violence. I've faced that growing up too, but it's just really hard to talk about it because of the fact of like, I don't know my race. Is it now a racial issue, gun violence in the Latino community? It's hard to like really explain that because they don't count Latinos as a race. So it's just navigating through that. And like when you mentioned the 2016 election, I just remember a lot of fear, especially when they were, saying the whole thing with like build the wall. And I remember like texting my dad when Trump got elected, and I was like, oh, like, are we just never gonna see Grandpa again? Because he got deported. And he was like, yeah, probably not. And it was just really like a really big pill to swallow then. And it still is now, because even though he's no longer in office, there's still a lot of things that are still being affected now because of him. And I just feel like with the Trump administration, it was kind of like a mirror. It shined light into a lot of the problems America like has already faced, if that makes sense. And then also going forward, like now with the pandemic, I have a statistic. That's why I've been like touching my phone. I'm trying to like not let it shut down. But according to the CDC, Hispanics and Latinos are 1.7 times more likely to contract COVID-19. And I just thought that was really crazy because just in general, COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting people of color. And just seeing that number, I'm like, wow, you can see that. And there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of effects that go into that. So lack of health care or diet, just lack of resources and education in general in our community. So it's super hard how a global pandemic can really affect us, and how I use my identity to like kind of combat that. So I'm currently working on a project to promote students to get vaccinated, and I'm being very strategic on who I'm picking in this promotional video. I'm picking students of color because they're being disproportionately affected, and we need that representation there, because there are a lot of people who aren't getting vaccinated out of fear in our community. So just showing them like, hey, it's okay, please get tested because we don't want our people to die. I hope that answers that question.
That's a really great point about environmental racism and how just access to resources is completely the education is there, and then the vaccine is already a hot topic. If you don't have any education about it, you're gonna see the news and kind of more scared to get it.
So I don't know. I feel like very similar to Alice. It's always been super confusing to me what my race is, because there's like a checklist and there's like certain things you can check off. It's like Hispanic isn't one of them. So it's just really confusing because like I always would just have to check off white, but I don't feel like it just accurately portrays like my identity. And when it comes to like race in terms of current events, as a director of governmental affairs, currently I'm tracking House Bills 322 and 327. And the main aim of these bills is to say that you have to be impartial when you're teaching historical oppression of marginalized groups. And the meaning of the word impartial is treating both sides equally, which is wrong. And it limits challenging and uncomfortable discussions. And it's just super important. If we want to work on fixing race relations, the first thing is to raise awareness and actually have those conversations, which is why it's so important that I'm advocating against these bills.
We're glad you're doing that as well.
So as far as any local events, the election that was talked about by Alice, I think for me, one of the things I remember was DACA, right? Thinking about DACA and how scared folks were here on campus. We had well over 200 DACA students on campus at that time, that they literally didn't know, like, were they not going to be able to graduate? Were they not going to be able to go to class? Should they go to class? All of those things. So I remember we were doing some work in SMC in my office, but also me with some of my students at the time that were Latinas and other folks. So there's that part that I remember trying to advocate. And DACA doesn't personally impact me. I was born here. I don't have to worry. I never had to worry about that, right? And it doesn't mean that I shouldn't have to advocate for that, right? We talked about privilege before. I think when we recognize the awareness that we have those privileges, right? Eric and I are male presenting. We have privileges that Alice and Ari, right? Like we do. What do we do with that to help lift their voice and extend the opportunity for them? That's just here's the seat, but don't talk, please. Right? Right? And you probably experienced that. So I can do this without side polite. So I think there's that piece. I think the House bills as an educator, as an early childhood educator, as somebody who works and fights for education, as a diversity trainer and educator and all those things. I find those bills, many others, like DACA, problematic, right? When we think about like racism should not be value free, right? To your point, right? It isn't like racism is not good or bad, it just happened. Like slavery is not good or bad, it just happened, right? No, we have to be able to make sure that there's value placed on that. So when I think about some of the major events that happened in communities of color, for Latinos, but really, I look at how might I leverage my privileges, right? I might have been born on food stamps with a single mother and all these things without education, but I'm getting ready to have a doctorate. My wife has a doctorate, right? We have privileges now because of those things. I get entered into spaces because of those degrees and things that maybe even they don't get to go to. How might I be able to uplift and use that? Because I think that is when, I suppose that's my responsibility. I believe that's be my responsibility. Is it hard? And does it suck sometimes when people, well, how did you get here? You got invited? Yeah, I'm actually presenting, right? Like those kind of things where, they picked you for the flyer, right? No, they picked me because of these things. And sometimes it is unfortunate, and sometimes it's not right. It sucks that we have to maybe tell people, and people just don't take it. They take it, others, I'm like, well, of course you're here. Why are they? Of course, and I have to explain why. So when I think about all these major things that happens in my identity, yes, there's times when I fight for folks who probably identify similarly, but oftentimes it's not, right? And so I think that there's really, again, that what's the responsibility of the privileges I have? Some of it I've earned, some of it I have not earned. My gender expression, I've not earned that, but it does open up things that I can ask for, right? I get paid more than most women get this for the same amount of work, right? But I'm just gonna be honest. But then how do I go be part of the Women's Center or other places to be able to talk about those things as a male? Because y'all women talk about that. A bunch of women talking about how you're not paid versus the reality of like, why are Black women being paid less than their counterparts, right? Like just and might even be more qualified. Like they have to have the doctorates in the years, and they've been here. So I'm gonna just keep going because I'm like, you don't need to start going on this end and then start going to a little bit, but that's how I look at how my identity has been impacted by these things, about the presidential things, but even the local things, right? Like the rock. But those things impact maybe not me personally because I'm not Black. And I'm a person of color, and you are, right? And you are. And that impacts me. And when people don't, then I'm going to figure out again how do I use my privileges to make sure that it happens less or not at all.
You actually brought up the point that I'm going to kind of discuss a little bit too. You brought up something that was really impactful as well as using our own privileges for certain things. So my reaction to the 2016 election, and especially the massive deportation was that I wanted to do that when I was older. So I'm currently applying to law school to be an English because I do speak Spanish. I have clear skin, and I can advocate for those people in those spaces, and will be hopefully able to help them a lot. And also just be able to identify a little bit with these people as well. Here's this lawyer coming on and just talk to me.
No, that's important. I would make for sure.
Well, that gets to the end of my scripted questions. So if anyone in the audience has any questions, or if anyone has anything else they'd like to touch on at all.
I can ask a question. So in everyone's experiences in their leadership roles, how would you suggest that like other people be allies to people within your identity? So if there's any advice you could give to our student leaders who might be tuning in today, I think that would be really helpful to know like how to champion for other people and really like be allies to identities that maybe might not be seen as well.
I don't even know how to be an ally for myself sometimes. Especially being like our multicultural spaces are just naturally predominantly Black. So with that, it's like, how do I make sure the Latinx Hispanic community is being represented? So like, I need to be an ally for that myself, and it's just really hard. I guess not counting us as the other, because that is something I face all the time. Like, story I have. So I was the executive director for Kent Interval Council. We had a unity gala last year. They kept mentioning like AAPI community, Black community, and they said and other. And I'm like, I'm the president, you know, I'm Latina, and I'm not another. I am one of the few people that are part of this community that have held this role. I do not take that lightly, especially with the rock situation happening last year. It affected a lot of people, all people of color. There's a lot of stuff we had to do. I don't like being minimized like that, you know. My mom didn't come here and risk her life just to have her daughter be considered another. So I just making sure we're being inclusive, like Eric said before, being inclusive so we can feel belong in those spaces. And it could be something just acknowledging our presence and also recognizing that like all of us look very different. And that's something I have to be conscious of as well. Like when I talk about Latinx, Hispanics, I'm not just talking about people who look like me.
I just like, I would say kind of the same thing as Alice. It was really hard to think of an answer for that question. I think the best thing would be just to listen, because I feel like sometimes when I do actually talk about my experience, it's kind of dismissed sometimes. Kind of like what Alice was saying, so just making sure that you're listening and not judging, and just accepting that that is the experience.
No, you go ahead.
You hopping yourself on. So I think there's a difference between being an ally and being an advocate. An ally says, yes, I believe that women should be paid as much as men. I believe that Black Lives Matter. Like, I believe that, you know, people should marry whoever they want to marry, right? Like, I believe those things. I think an advocate is somebody who's doing something about it, who's actually at times, because I think, you know, equity sometimes feels like oppression for those who are privileged. So if you get to be paid as much as that means I don't get a raise, right? Like, or I don't get the opportunity to sit on that board, or whatever the case may be. And so I think and I know it goes for most, but I think when it, particularly to Latinx or Latinx, I'm glad you brought that up. I see you. Is not only saying I believe that it should be there and not the other, right? I actually was at that event remotely, and I heard that too, so remember that. I felt some type of way as well, salty. I was salty, right? Because I think too, one of the things that's talking about her events, one of the things that's been a real struggle for me, I don't know about y'all, it's like, it's been very apparent that, you know, people who are Black have been murdered and absolutely continue, right? And right now, Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that I don't matter, right? Like that's not what it means. It also the shootings in Atlanta with the API, like yes, there was at that time Jimmy, then there was like those two things like kind of like unfortunately were happening kind of nationally. But sometimes it feels being Latino, Latina, that we're not necessarily allowed to say, well, what about us? Right? Like, and I think that can be hard. And as much as people may stereotypically think Latinos are loud and you know, we actually are typically not monolithic one. So that's one thing I just want to make sure when I say this. But we don't often say, look at me. That's not, at least that's not how I was raised. You put your head, you work, right? You know, and so because of that, there's a conflict or a tension in how we are or how we are as a group, knowing that we're also not monolithic. So when I think about advocacy, is how can you make sure you're doing the things, allowing the folks to actually say things, and not just be, tell me what it's like to be Afro-Latina for everybody.
Yeah.
Right? You don't know what that means, you know, or Colombian, right? Like, et cetera, et cetera. So, as a Puerto Rican who doesn't speak Spanish, because I was raised in foster care, even within my own community, I'm called some things, right? On Puerto Rico and stuff, I can understand it enough,
I couldn't do it all the way, and so I'm glad they are multilingual, right? That's amazing. So I think ally advocate, I believe it should happen. We're not doing something to make sure it does, right? So that's how maybe it's advice that, and there's a distinction, it's small sometimes, but it has a huge impact. I believe.
I totally agree with everything you're saying. I agree with everybody as well. To add on to it for being advocate is also to think before you talk, like think about your language that you're about to say to somebody. Like act like, you know, at least how I treat people is that this is the most important person in the room. And I'm gonna treat them with the highest respect. And, you know, like, I don't know, today I had a situation where there was like a mix up with like a different Ari, but somebody that I didn't know knew me. And I was like, oh shoot, like that's crazy. So like, I'm always aware of people in the room, and like, even if I don't know them, I'm like treating them with the highest respect. So I watch my language, I present myself with poise, and I just expect that like everybody that's at a function that I'm at was asked to be here, and that they are, you know, it's very important. Because yeah, and if you watch the language that you say, because like you don't know who this person is. This could be like, you know, like I have a situation like, oh, like that's the president, like that's the vice president, like this is circle, and I just like screw up and said something. So, you know, like we're everywhere. We all look different. We all have different backgrounds, and just like make sure that you pay attention to your language, and then maybe also pay attention to your friend's language, how they're speaking about Latin people or Afro Latin or like any kind of mixture, because it's like, you know, it's a respect thing. Like if you claim you're an ally and an advocate, then those are some of the stepping stools that are really small that you could do that can help, or that can teach somebody an important lesson. You can teach yourself a lesson. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for your wonderful answers.
All right.
And